Okay, so this video is the last video in the academic ableism series, and we're just going to be talking about the second half of chapter 5, and then just general thoughts and reflections and stuff. I realized that in every video in this series, I've either worn a blazer or a button-down shirt, and if that doesn't scream Capricorn energy, like, I don't know what does, honestly. I feel like today we have very, very dark academia vibes, which I love. It's like when you want to look cute, but you also want to look like a prof, but you also want to look like a vampire. This is what you get. Okay, so the first subsection of this half of the chapter is called Failure and Refusal, and here Dolmage makes the point that the segregated or contingent communities in the movies he mentions develop powerful rhetorics of failure and refusal. They can be seen to critique higher education by revealing the unfairness of the meritocracy and by developing alternatives. He explains that there's always been resistance to academic ableism, so we shouldn't be surprised that these movies center on themes of student solidarity and defiance. He says that Monsters University, Old School, Back to School, and Real Genius are all driven by the prospect of the protagonists either flunking out of school or of being rejected, but by the time the movies end, we understand that the success that higher education offers isn't really worth all the trouble. Their eventual failure doesn't stop the characters from jumping through all of the hoops and measurements necessary to be deemed successful under the ridiculous terms, it just stops them from finally accepting the idea of being judged by them. The one film he mentions which flips this script is Accepted, where students set up their own alternative university without accreditation. He references Scott Sandage, who writes that failure pervades the cultural history of capitalism, and argues that American capitalism has been constructed so that we see failure as a moral sieve that traps the loafer and passes the true man through. Dolmage explains that clearly we're asked to understand North American universities as very much a central part of this moral sieve, yet failure can have its own moral or ethical subversiveness. He then references Judith Halberstam, who explains that failure provides the opportunity to critique the belief that success happens to good people and failure is just a consequence of a bad attitude rather than structural conditions. Failure can reveal structural ableism and other forms of entrenched oppression while making space for other ways of knowing and learning. This is clearly the argument that Accepted in particular is making, yet all of these movies, to a certain degree, champion failure as a means of critiquing the disabling structures and the false meritocracy of higher education. He explains that these acts of failure and of corruption are often infused with powerful anti-intellectual sentiment, but then at the same time, why do we want to view stories in which college degrees can be bought or in which they aren't worth anything at all? So he suggests that perhaps the general public has distrusted higher education from the get-go. These films seem to show that popular culture doesn't trust college or university very much, in part perhaps because the outsiders or underdogs are so clearly disadvantaged by its normative cultures and mechanisms, even if the real world is no less ableist. He states that when we even witness disability on campus on film, this challenges the normativity of film and of campuses. He says that this might be metaphorized by the title Back to School, a title that also narrates a positionality, turning one's back on school or at least approaching it sideways, skeptically, an apt description of the general public's sentiment about university and college life and learning. In terms of who this public is, Dolmage remarks that some of the popularity of this critique is generational. Those who are graduates of college or university use the critique to reinforce the sense that they had it harder in their day and their privilege is thus more deserved. While for people who didn't go to college and don't plan to, the critique is also about reinforcing the systems and beliefs that assign value to your own path and your own choices. He states that in a culture in which higher education seems like a monolithic good and a requirement for access to privilege, it's reasonable to want to critique it and valorize other options. Maybe this is why we celebrate some of these characters dropping out. He closes the section by saying that in the end, watching these films might convince us that the public doesn't seem to like university administrators or professors, and also seems to dislike students for whom success in their university studies seems natural and easy. He says that in a climate in which academia is increasingly under fire for coddling students, for promoting identity politics, for being too liberal, it will be increasingly important to better understand these critiques and this back-to-school positioning. The next subsection is called The Disabled Professor: How to Win an Oscar. Dolmage explains that although the general public seems to be somewhat wary of academia for a variety of reasons, on the other hand, Hollywood seems to love disabled professors. It's this thing of, oh, you want an Oscar? Go disabled. There's a long history of actors who aren't disabled playing disabled characters in movies, the argument being that they're stretching their theatrical chops because disability has to feel like the most foreign experience there is. Dolmage says that when that able-bodied actor confidently walks up to the stage to eloquently accept their Academy Award, everyone can feel better knowing that it was all an act. He explains that further, in movies where a character becomes progressively more disabled as the movie goes on, having an able-bodied character to flash back to throughout the movie strongly reinforces the idea that the able self is the real person underneath the disability. Disability is just a neat costume. We're encouraged to identify with the able professor they were, rather than the disabled person they've become, and the disabled people that we'll all become. Tying this into academia, Dolmage states that these movies actually play on the fears of many temporarily able-bodied academics. What if the very things I've based my career around, like my intellect, my ability to concentrate, to stand and deliver, were gone tomorrow? This fear overwhelms much more reasonable questions, like, for instance, what will my employer do to protect my right to workplace accommodations as my abilities change, because all abilities do? What can I do to advocate for the rights of others who can contribute to academia greatly, but need a few accommodations in order to do so? He says that when a medical professional explains a character primarily through their deficits and diagnoses, the audience is supposed to feel scared. So in the movie Still Alice, where Alice is a professor with early onset Alzheimer's, Alice's role as a scholar adds to the power of this diagnosis. We're supposed to feel pity because the expert is now the specimen. Ideally, this pity might reveal some of the power imbalance of medicalization, or the ways that higher education reinforces the binary between researcher and researched, medical authority and medical anomaly. However, in Hollywood, more often it simply robs the disabled person of agency, renders them powerless, and makes their identity mainly about their disability. He's talked a lot about the impact of academia on students, and obviously these structures affect disabled faculty as well, but here he mentions them more explicitly. He explains that in academia, in spite of some calls for faculty members to be more open about disability, the administrative and cultural milieu for disabled faculty remains relatively inhospitable, whether overtly or covertly. Disabled people with PhDs are much more likely to end up underemployed, exploited as adjunct labor, and to experience discrimination as a result of their disability. He explains that faculty attitudes about disability seem to sort their potential colleagues into two fictional worlds: the world of the superhero, where that disabled colleague will dramatically compensate for their disability, rising above the competition, or they'll exist in the world of gumdrop unicorns, where asking for the right to accommodation, a right established a quarter of a century ago in the United States, situates you in this fantasy world. He ends the subsection by asking, why do disabled characters show up in Oscar nominations year after year, but with no disabled people in these roles? He suggests that Hollywood, in this way, is just like higher education, where disability is studied and represented everywhere, most often in the absence of employment of actual people with disabilities, and definitely in an environment where it's still profoundly dangerous to disclose disability. Hollywood thus ensures that the public never really understands disability as a culture or a movement, never views disabled people as the largest minority in North America, with rights that are often unprotected and overlooked. He states that the Academy also ignores the tremendous artistic and academic production and talent of disabled people themselves. Disability can safely continue to exist as something purely theatrical and highly theoretical. The final subsection is called Not Yet, and it focuses on the idea of time. So Dolmage begins by describing a scene from the movie Still Alice, where the main character Alice is jogging around her campus, a regular activity for her that's second nature, but she becomes confused and can't recognize where she is, which is a sign of her early onset Alzheimer's. He then explains that in the film Monsters University, we see a slug slowly making their way to class at the beginning of the movie, and then at the very end of the movie, after a full year or full semester of classes, the slug finally makes it to class, and so it's supposed to be this funny, humorous thing. He says that the slug represents what Tanya Tuchkovsky calls the not yet time of disability within higher education. There's no way that the environment is going to accommodate his pace individually, but his trajectory also physicalizes the chronology of being marked out for wearing out in higher education, or the ways that college keeps certain bodies and minds in abeyance. He explains that the slug is moving in what we can call crip time, recognizing how expectations of how long things should take should account for a range of types of bodies and minds so that we can bend the clock rather than bending bodies. He says Margaret Price suggests that crip time is the flexible approach to normative time frames. It's generally been interpreted as responsive, a way to impose critical delay through the refusal to follow strict schedules that might be normative, ableist, medically rehabilitative, and so on. Dolmage explains that in arguing that a standard and obedient response to time and timing actually overlooks unique opportunities for making meaning, we can also situate crip time as an epistemology, a way of thinking and moving. Normative time is what usually structures college life. It renders the slug late rather than the college campus inaccessible because it doesn't have a bus for slugs. The idea of curative time syncs with this normative time because it describes the patterns in which one must always be getting better on a college campus, which is why going for a jog seems like such a perfectly academic thing for Alice to do in the movie Still Alice. The films he mentions throughout the chapter also use the filmic device of the montage to highlight speed and performance. This reveals the university to be an inverse of crypt time and accessible pedagogy, as a place that's both rigid and rushed, in a manner that makes learning seem exceedingly stressful and difficult, if possible at all. He quotes Dean Barb in Back to School, who says, "There are two types of people in business today, the quick and the dead." This seems to apply to the university as well. He then talks about the idea of filmic time, which can be understood as the temporal ordering and arrangement of events in film to fit the action into 100 minutes, which is generally quite different from real time. He explains that crypt time and the montage fall at two ends of the spectrum of filmic time. He says that time is a subjective thing. Although we think of it as needing to be uniform, standard, and normal, it's actually experienced differently by different people and malleable. So like the body itself, time can only cling to a fantasy of normality, and therefore we need modifiers to properly understand time. He asserts that there's no one type of time. Instead, for example, there's academic time and there's filmic time, the time constraints that films have to fit into, but also the version of time that the film argues for. Dolmage explains that one of the key ways we control and shape the experience of time is through mediums like long-form Hollywood films, so we need terms like filmic time because they show us that movies shape time in particular ways. He notes that the ways in which popular films plot out these bursts of time tend to be normative, so when he uses the term filmic time, he's also saying normate time, the ways that time disciplines the experience of disability and the ways that disability can only appear in a prescriptive, limited way. He demonstrates that generally, disabled characters are shown as a drag upon filmic time, too fast, too slow, always held in the not yet space of disability, mandated by its not me status. Disabled characters usually either die or are cured when a film is sequenced in a normative way. Even when there are flashbacks and flash forwards and dream sequences, disabled characters often get depicted as obsessing about memories of their previously able selves or dreaming of cures and normative futures. He asserts that one of the main ways that mainstream film controls and shapes perceptions of time is through its treatment of the disabled body. When a disabled character is cured, they're cured because the viewer needs to believe that they themselves would be cured or would compensate or would overcome if they became disabled. When disabled characters die, there's the satisfaction of another, perhaps eugenic type of fantasy. This extends so far as to the casting of films. Every time a disability is depicted by a non-disabled actor, the audience is already jumping to that actor's next able-bodied role, their disability drop. Dolmage says that he wants to end the chapter by suggesting that perhaps the ultimate fantasy of education in these films and in popular culture is that learning itself has a predictable narrative arc or a sequential chronology, that it takes place across normate time, across campuses that we will always be at home in or will always be recognizable to us, and that this narrative somehow makes us all more able, even slowly, through the gradual progression of positive eugenics. Instead of seeing education as a process of accumulation and realization, transfer, continuity, coherence, or progression, it's a process of recursion, forgetting, simultaneity, regression, and chaos. His hope is that we can refocus on the failures and refusals which appear in these films. Further, because through them we spend so much actual time with the underdogs, with those constructed as disabled or shown to be disabled by the pedagogies we witness in the films, he explains that we can ultimately resist the fantasy of segregation and perhaps reframe the who, the how, and the when of higher education. He remarks that while these films drastically misrepresent college life in many ways, these movies about university also know and show more about universities than universities themselves do. That is, universities and their stakeholders are not aware of themselves as exclusionary. Instead, they carefully curate themselves as diverse. Every rejection and failure in higher education can be carefully justified, quantified, and legally explained by the organization, while in the movies and in the actual lives of students, they feel arbitrary, frequent, and personal. Universities will not admit their role in rape culture even when they establish small committees of the powerless to address sexual violence, and large committees of powerful lawyers to perform the calculus required to avoid lawsuits. The curriculum and the pedagogy of the college instructor is closely guarded by standards and elitism and intellectual freedom, even when this teaching can take away from the freedom of students and leaves them confused, stressed, and ignored. He says that in the end, perhaps we should trust Hollywood more than we trust the public relations departments of universities. Dolmage explains that the classroom is a rhetorical space, one that must be read carefully and critically, and one that can be reshaped. It's also a public and a proto-public space. It forms routines, modes, power dynamics, empowerments, opportunities, exclusions, inclusions, disablements, accommodations, designs, failures, successes, limits, and possibilities that extend into the public sphere. Classrooms reflect and shape larger cultural and social trends. Higher education is a social, eugenic, and economic experiment, an experiment with human subjects, not just with abstract ideas. He continues, saying that the university is also increasingly a retro-private space, meaning that private industry leaders and private industry values get imported into academia to try to clean it up or to wrest power away from the self-governance of academics. More and more often, higher education is a political pawn, a place where the proto-public potential of the classroom is harnessed by governors, premiers, and other politicians who understand that they can utilize the university to make ideological arguments. So, they endanger tenure or they cancel programs that they see as teaching only political correctness. They harness the doubtful, skeptical, critical attitude of the public toward the university, knowing that they can gain a certain group of voters by attacking the elitism of the university. In this way, the politicians follow the lead of movies about higher education. That being said, these films also harness the positive energy that comes from learning and the positive energy that results when students begin taking control of their own learning, often in opposition to the traditional regimes of education. So that was chapter 5. The final section of this book is called Commencement, and it's not really a chapter, it's more of just like closing remarks and directions to other resources. And so he explains here that the final edits for this book were completed in the last few weeks of the Trump-Clinton presidential race of 2016, and then Trump won. Here he basically explains that even though we may have seen some of the academic ableism attitudes before, we should expect them to increase over Trump's term. As he predicted, Trump has had devastating effects for education, disability rights, as well as the rights of other oppressed groups. He explains all of this, and it seems quite depressing and hopeless, but he says that clearly there's a lot of work to do, and he directs people to resources to help those who care about creating a more inclusive, less discriminatory academy that refuses the eugenic legacy of higher education. The latter half of this section is extremely helpful. He tells you exactly what you might be interested in reading further if you're about to teach, if you're a faculty member requesting accommodations, if you're about to publish something, if you're involved in hiring, if you're working on a syllabus, and just so much more. It's so great. And also, all the things, or at least most of the things that he references, there are actual embedded links to in the actual book document itself. So you can just click on it and go directly to whatever he was talking about. He acknowledges that fighting academic ableism will be extremely difficult because we're grappling with huge structural inequities, but no matter what your role is in this dynamic, he says that there's real resources to help you avoid the ableism inherent in existing within these structures. He emphasizes that there's always going to be disabled students in your class and disabled faculty on your campus. Such a student or faculty member may already, or in the future, be you. So, we must imagine a future in which disability does not need to be denied or hidden or tokenized or erased. Okay, so now that we've gone through the content of this book, I'm just going to go through like personal reflections and things that stood out to me and stuff, and there's definitely stuff I'm going to miss because this entire book is so good, but I'll just go through some of them. So one of the first things that stood out to me is the idea that eugenics is still a thing. As I've said previously, I think that before reading this book, I thought of eugenics as something that was like, still somewhat there, but not in the institution. But this book really reveals just how ingrained eugenics is in academic spaces. You just have to look a little harder to see it because there's no longer things like overt disabling experiments taking place. Obviously, I knew that academia runs like a business, I've talked about it before, but this book really showed me just how that business model specifically plays itself out on disabled bodies and minds, and how capitalism and neoliberalism affect things. Also, I really got a deeper look into the world of academic accommodations and the way they work as retrofits and defeat devices. Retrofits and defeat devices are just something else that stood out to me in this book, but how they apply to accommodations and the implications of accommodating bodies and minds without committing to changing the space that makes those accommodations necessary in the first place just really made me think. I think one of the biggest things that I took away from this book was the ideas of universal design and usability for teaching and learning, and I really appreciate that Dolmage sort of presented both sides and showed that while universal design is obviously better than our current system, it also has drawbacks and there's pitfalls, and there are ways that it can also be ableist if someone doesn't take the proper precautions. I feel like a lot of the time when people are trying to advocate for something, they'll only present the positives or the benefits of it because they feel like talking about the negatives will turn people away. But for me, the fact that Dolmage analyzed both sides of universal design and actually went in depth into the potential drawbacks of it just further convinced me to seriously consider its implementation, because now I feel that I'm going in informed. I can go in with a clear idea of the harm that it could cause and that I want to avoid causing. At one point in the book, he mentioned something about how the normative processes of teaching we have ensure that the process of learning is accidental. If you happen to have a particular type of learner in your class, maybe things will work for them, but you're not designing things for all bodies and minds, and so any learning that may happen is by chance. And so that really blew my mind, because I want to be intentional about my teaching and ensure that I'm not like teaching in such a way where it's like I'm throwing darts at a dartboard blindfolded and just like hoping something will stick by chance, you know? The final thing I want to talk about is how this book is written. So for accessibility purposes, there's written explanations of all the visual materials in this book. Even if you can't see the accompanying pictures, just by reading or listening, you'll be able to get a clear idea of what he's referring to, and so you don't miss any essential context by not being able to see the few pictures that are included. Even though sometimes the sentences can be a little hard to untangle, the book is peppered with sections where he'll say something in a somewhat complicated manner and then say more simply or in simpler terms, and really try to make sure that he's explaining all of his ideas in plain language. And like, I think that I'm pretty good at deciphering academic speak, but there were a few times when I read a section or a quote and I was like, what's he saying? And then I read the more simply section and I was like, oh, okay. Also, I love how repetitive he can be at times. There's little paragraphs or sentences in this book that he will word for word repeat at multiple sections in it, and I just find that his restating of ideas and definitions and things like that is so helpful for me as a reader. I feel like a lot of academics would criticize this and say that like he's being redundant and that this restating is unnecessary, but Dolmage shows that in this book, redundancy is not a bad thing, and it in fact makes things more accessible both through words and just in physical design. I also love that this book is not just presented as theory. It's not just some random scholar writing about things without connecting it to the real world. He does a really, really good job of connecting everything to the real world and making concepts relatable to readers. For me, when reading things about race, gender, and disability and stuff like that, if I read something that's presented in a very theoretical, disconnected, impersonal way, it just rubs me the wrong way. Like, I feel off reading it because I feel like those topics, they're things that affect real people. Like, these are real life scenarios. People have real lived experiences of like actual oppression. And so maybe it's just a me thing, but whenever I read a scholarly article that's talking about like race and gender and disability and stuff like that, and it's written in that way, I just like, oh, like I really don't like it. Like as I'm reading it, I go, oh, and this book didn't do that, which I really appreciate. I thought like at certain points when he was talking about universal design, I was like, okay, so we're talking about all these frameworks and like, okay, but like, what do we do with that? But then he actually did go into that and like gave us practical ways to apply this and examples and stuff. So I was like, thanks, Jay. Another thing that I just really appreciated was the intersectional lens he took when writing this book. And obviously, like, the book is about disability centrally, but I really like that in that he also acknowledged other things, like how disability and race intersect and other things like that. I think that that's really important, and I definitely want to read more about that because this book isn't about that, it just mentioned it, but there's other sources that he directs you to. Even though this book is called Academic Ableism, I feel like it's the type of book where like everyone should read it. Anyone who's in education in any capacity should read it. I mean, you don't necessarily need to read the entire thing because a lot of things are specifically talking about academia, but the sections on universal design and stuff like that, so like, I think it was chapter 4, like those I feel like it would be good for anybody to read it, just anyone who's interacting with people, teaching in any way. And I feel like even for students, this is a good book to read because it like tells you what you can advocate for and what you can point to be like, well, you know, if I want this accommodation, here's the defeat device you're using, here's the retrofit you're using. It like gives you the correct vocabulary to be able to explain to like a prof or a teacher that's like refusing to give you accommodations, or if you take it to admin and you're like, okay, this person won't give me my accommodations. It gives you the like general knowledge and background to be able to articulate yourself, I think. I hadn't really looked into anything about academia and disability before, and I feel like this book gave me a really good primer on that sort of topic, and so now I think I really want to look into stuff about intersectionality and disability in academia, and so if I find any really good things, maybe I'll do a video on them. If anyone's actually been keeping up with this series, thank you! I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, not much else to say, so bye! I don't know if you'll see this, but thank you to Sarah Fourcassier for leaving me such sweet comments. They like made my day. I don't know if I'm saying your last name right. My French pronunciation is so bad. You know the French like uvular R or whatever? I can't do it. It's like the R, you know the R that's like at the back of your throat where your like tongue hits your uvula? Yeah, I can't do it. So if your last name, if the R in your last name, like The Fourcassier has that? Sorry. I filmed like 7 videos in 9 days, and now my brain is going to crash. I'm so happy that I'm done.